As it so often goes with professional wrestling, you'll have those shows that stand out as a real cut above the rest. You'll have those other shows that stand out as a real cut below the rest. And then you have those shows that are just kind of there. They never fit into the good or great category, never fit into the bad or terrible category. They just end up really being largely forgettable. And when I think about SummerSlam 1990, from the Spectrum in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that's kind of what I think about. This was not a terrible show. This was not a bad show. But on the flip side, again, it wasn't a good show, and it most certainly wasn't a great show. There's some good moments in there. There were still a couple of good matches on this show. But in general, this is a show that you can largely skip. I mean, from the opening tag match, where the previous 2 years you had great opening tag matches with the British Bulldogs versus the Fabulous Rougeaus, and then you had the Brain Busters versus the Hart Foundation. Now you get here to SummerSlam 1990 and it's Power and Glory versus the Rockers. That's right, Paul Roman, Hercules, if you will, versus the Rockers. Let's think about that for a second. It was funny when I went back and watched this, to think that at one point in time they were big enough on Kerry Von Erich, 1 foot and all, that they had him beat Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental Championship at this show. It's a shame too when you go back and you watch the Texas Tornado, Kerry Von Erich. This was a guy that obviously at one point in time was a huge star in his father Fritz Von Erich's territory down in Dallas, Texas, a one-time NWA world champion. And he was a guy that, had that look, no question about it, had that kind of all-American personality, that great charisma that you just can't teach. But by this point in time in his career, with the amputation of the foot, he was a shell of the worker that he once was. He was never a phenomenal, like, five-star classic type of worker. He wasn't in the classification of a David or, frankly, even a Kevin in terms of the Von Erich boys, in terms of a worker. But Kerry could still hold his own back in the day, back in his prime, but sadly, when you got to the Texas Tornado, you were primarily getting by on look and charisma, and that was about it. And they went out there and had about the best match you could expect the Texas Tornado to have had at that point in time in his career. You got things like Warlord beating Tito Santana. And again, there were a few matches on this card that you just really felt like they were too short, and they really, frankly, could have done without them. Sometimes, it is better to have fewer matches but have the matches go longer. Sometimes, if you structure things right, you can have 9, 10 matches on a 3 hour show and give everything the appropriate amount of time and make it really work. Well, here you had 10 matches on this show and it largely didn't work. The best match of the night, for my money, obviously has to be the Tag Team Championship match. It was a 2 out of 3 falls event featuring the Hart Foundation taking on Demolition, Smash, and Crush. And, this was a really good tag team title match. Again, it harkens back to the days of the great tag teams that the WWE once had, in the great tag team division the WWE once had. There was a point in time that, outside of like a Hogan or a Warrior or a Savage, the only other thing I really cared about with the WWF, frankly, was the tag team wrestling, because there were so many great tag teams at the time. You had the Rockers, you had the Hart Foundation. I'd go on and on and on and on and on. But you had several tag matches on this show, but obviously this was the one that stood out. Another great tag team match on a SummerSlam card featuring the Hart Foundation. Imagine that. Another theme of this show was that the Big Boss Man was in a very big way featured very prominently on this show. He was the special referee for Jake Roberts versus Bad News Brown. I don't know what the whole box thing was. I still don't. Yeah. Again, a match that would seem on paper to have really been able to work, and it just kind of didn't. I don't know why. It just didn't. And maybe it was just there to really try and get the boss man over as a babyface, and perhaps that's what it was there for. Maybe that was the purpose. But again, just like with Volkov and Duggan versus the Orient Express, and Warlord and Tito Santana, these are just matches that were there that didn't have much time, didn't seem to have much purpose, and are largely forgettable, and probably didn't deserve to be on such a premier show like this one. You got one of the big stories that played out throughout this and in the weeks leading up to this is the $1 Million Man attempting to buy Sapphire. And I'm sure Vince loved that. Let's give her the racist name of Sapphire and let's have the white man try to buy the black woman. Vince loves that. But anyway, so earlier on, Sapphire was a no-show for a match against Queen Sherry. Later on, we get to Savage versus Dusty Rhodes. It wasn't, again, really much of a match, but that wasn't exactly what was important here. You were trying to get over the fact that the $1 Million Man had bought Sapphire away from Dusty Rhodes, and he's all upset about it, and he can't believe it, and da-da-da. And again, it's just... I just want you to think about this for a second. Here's the rundown of the matches on this show in terms of the 10 official matches that you had. You went 6 minutes, 5 minutes, no time technically at all, 5 minutes. You had the tag title match, which went almost 15. You had a 4-minute match between Jake and Bad News, a 3-minute match with Duggan and Volkov versus the Orient Express, a 2-minute match with Savage and Dusty Rhodes. This card was desperately lacking for matches that had consequence, had meaning, and had time to them. Then you get to Hulk Hogan versus Earthquake, and it's one of these things you're surprised that this match, because it involved Hogan, didn't main event the show. And I guess at least to the WWF's credit, maybe to Hogan's credit, probably more so to Vince's credit, they knew better than to potentially sabotage their new champion in the Ultimate Warrior by having him not main event. And they figured they had enough of a storyline between him and Rick Rude that match deserved to have main event billing. And here you got, a semi-main event that kind of worked. Again, you got Boss Man in Hogan's corner. This was easily the highlight of Earthquake's career, other than if you look at the footage of him in Japan getting ready to do that shoot fight. His match was kind of there. Hogan winning via countout. Yeah. Like I said, again, largely there. I don't classify it as bad, but it most certainly wasn't any damn good. And then even when you got to the main event, the steel cage match between Rude and Warrior for the WWF Championship, you look back on it and you would think there would be more. You would have expected more, especially considering that these guys had story going back over a year, going back to the Royal Rumble of 1989, and how good of dance partners and how really good they complemented each other, how really well they did anyways. You would have thought that Warrior Rude would have been better in the steel cage, that it would have gotten more time. And it didn't. It was just like so many other matches on this card. It didn't get the time that it needed. It didn't do what it needed to do. I don't think it told enough of a story like it needed to. Again, it was not bad, but I definitely would not classify it as very good, or I'm not even sure if I would classify it as good. It was just kind of there. It was a big pay-per-view victory for the Ultimate Warrior as WWF champion. And maybe, again, that's all it was. You sat there and pretty much had him in a big storyline with Rick Rude for pretty much a span of over a year. And maybe they did that in part because they always felt that Rude was going to get the most out of Warrior. Perhaps, who knows? But again, like I said, the main event just perfectly crystallizes what could have been on this show, maybe what should have been on this show, and ultimately wasn't on this show. And I'm going to be honest with you. Out of the 10 matches or so-called matches on this show, the only one worth going back and watching is the Hart Foundation versus Demolition in that 2 out of 3 falls match for the Tag Team Championships. And even that match is not like a great epic tag title match. You can get by the rest of your life as a wrestling fan and never watch that match. This SummerSlam was frankly forgettable.